All right, Rob, I think you need to, there you go. All right, so thank you everyone who's able to attend today. Auditing is not one of those things that I consider a lot of fun. I am a certified information systems auditor. I'll get to my background briefly in a moment. But the reality is that as business continues to adapt and as we continue to have more and more data online and more sensitive data online and accessible, I can say that as I've watched auditing over the last 15 years, 20 years, what we audit for today and how stringently we audit for today makes what we did 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago look really simple. And at that time, we were thinking, oh, this is so onerous, this is so much to do. The reality is that auditing is going to be a part of our life, and it's only going to get more and more extensive as we go forward. So what I hope to talk to you about today are some of the things that you need to make sure that you cover with regards to SQL Server for when you have external auditors come in, when you have internal auditors looking at your systems. And I would say that the more you are up to speed on with what actually makes sense to audit, the more you can guide your auditors. Because one of the things I've found over time is a lot of times the auditors that come in are not subject matter experts on SQL Server. They know the basics of IT audit. They may not even come from a technical background. A lot of the IT auditors I know didn't come from an IT background. They actually came from a financial audit background, and previous to that, a financial background. So that's what today's topic is about. We're going to talk about what to focus on, what to look at, so that you'll be prepared before that audit walks through that door for you. So really briefly about me, I've served as a database administrator and architect. I'm currently an infrastructure and security architect, primarily over AD and Windows security and all the things that make up that realm. I can't figure out what I want to do with my life, so I keep bouncing back and forth between those two realms as far as IT is concerned. I've also spent time as an incident response team lead and actually just got done doing incident response, some exercises for my organization. So all that is fresh in my memory, and so some of that will probably come into the talk today. I am a certified information systems auditor. I have a strong IT background. I've come from IT. I've been doing IT since I was 14, 15 years old as a professional programmer. So I didn't understand the world of audit. I didn't understand why they were asking the questions they asked. I didn't understand what they were looking for a lot of the time. So what I did is I took some time to delve into their world and figure out why they focus on the things that they focus on and where their questions come from. And that led to a pursuit of the Certified Information Systems Auditor certification that is offered by ISACA. And that's going to come into the presentation today. And when I start talking about controls and things of that sort, I'm speaking the language that the auditors speak. And so when you hear those things, you should be able to tie the two together, especially if you haven't undergone a very stringent audit before, or if you had, but you're just like, what kind of language are they using? What are they talking about? Hopefully some of that will get cleared up today. I do write and blog on SQL Server security and security in general. Here's my contact information. I try to answer emails fairly quickly. It may take me a few days, depending on what else is going on. I am somewhat active on Twitter. I'm not as active as I was maybe a couple years ago, but you can usually get me there. I write 2 blogs. The first one, the True Solutions one, is the one on security and infrastructure. I'll admit both of these are kind of neglected, but there is information out there. The GK DBA is more along the lines of productivity and personal development, professional development type stuff. So if you're focused more on the technology, that's True Solutions. If you're looking for productivity, that's the GK DBA, and both for WordPress. So today I'm going to talk about 3 basic areas. The first one is one that we may neglect a lot with SQL Server, and that's the surface area, both SQL Server surface area and the operating system surface area. Now, when SQL Server 2005 came out, there was some tools around surface area, and surface area was made into a big deal. But since then, we've not emphasized it as much, but it's still important because the more you can reduce your surface area, the more you can reduce the ways to get into SQL Server, then the more you mitigate attacks, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure that the functionalities required of our business folks is honored, is met. If they need to get access to the data, they can. If they need to be able to modify the data, they can. But we want to protect the SQL servers and basically make them as hardened to attack as we can, because obviously the more that they're hardened, the less we have to worry about, the less risk there is to our organization, to us specifically, to our sleep cycles, and possibly to our careers. And so we're going to focus a little bit on that area today. So that's outside of the SQL Server realm. If you're strictly a database developer or strictly a SQL Server DBA who's within SQL Server, this may stretch you a little bit, but this is an area that needs to be addressed just like everything else. And then some of the things to look for at the server level as far as auditing is concerned and at the database level. And I bring those up because when I go and I do audits myself as an auditor, IT auditor, or when I train IT auditors, these are the things I look for, or I tell IT auditors to look for. And generally, I've found that those have been well received and they provide value. So if you go ahead and take care of these, you'll be a step ahead before any audit walks through your door. So when I think of surface area concerns, I classify these as outside of SQL Server, as in you're not connecting to SQL Server, you're not using Management Studio, you're not running TSQL commands, but they're important because if you think about it and you look at the vulnerabilities with regards to SQL Server over the last few years, most of the vulnerabilities have actually been at the operating system level. People compromise SQL Server by taking control of the operating system, or they'll attack a component that's sitting on that same server as the SQL Server that may have a weakness. It may not be the operating system, it may be some other installed application. And so we're worried about what an attacker can do, what an adversary can do outside of SQL Server that allows them to basically get into the SQL Server when they normally wouldn't. We're also interested in making our SQL Server as small as possible on the network. And those are SQL Server specific concerns, but again, they're not inside SQL Server. They're usually using other tools like SQL Server Configuration Manager, right? Or the plugin for SQL Server Configuration Manager if you're using MMC and computer management and connecting to, say, a SQL Server installed on Server Core, which, by the way, if you've not considered that, seriously consider doing so, because obviously the more you reduce the components running on an operating system, the less there is to attack. And I know there's back and forth with regards to going to core or not. I've seen some recent Twitter talks between some of the people in our community saying, hey, we should really consider Server Core. And the truth is that if you can make it run on Server Core and it fits your business processes, you really should. And that's not just SQL Server, that's anything that can be supported on Server Core, Active Directory, so on and so forth. So I'm going to talk about what to look for, some questions to think about, and basically the thought process that I go through, and you're going to see that for each of these three sections. So at the OS level, the first question I always ask is, who are the members of the local administrators group? This is the no-brainer one from an audit perspective, but for SQL Server DBAs, we really care, because if you're a member of the administrators group on a SQL Server server, if you start SQL Server up in single user mode, right, from the command line, documentation on how to start it up in single user mode is in books online. There's plenty of articles written about it. But the bottom line is that if I can start SQL Server up in single user mode and I'm an administrator as far as that server is concerned, and I'm the first one to connect in the SQL Server, then regardless of what the permissions are within SQL Server, I'm going to be treated as a sysadmin as far as SQL Server is concerned. This is a backdoor that's there to protect the SQL Server in case someone goes and deletes all the groups that had administrative rights and no one remembers the SA password, or the SA has been renamed and disabled and you can't get to it anyway. This is the backdoor. I start SQL Server up in single user mode. I'm a local administrator on the server. I connect to SQL Server. I have sysadmin rights for as long as that is running in single user mode and I'm connected. I make the appropriate security changes, and then I restart SQL Server and the appropriate folks can get back and administer the system. Well, obviously, if that backdoor exists so that we can get back in a SQL Server, it can be abused. And so I do care about who are the members of the local administrators group, and I obviously want to keep that as small as possible. Another thing I'm concerned about when I look at the OS is what shares are exposed. In most organizations, the administrative shares, the C dollar, the E dollar, the F dollar, basically the dollar for every drive letter that you have, is exposed. And those are typically not ones that you can disable. There are registry settings and group policy settings that you can use to get rid of the administrative shares. but a lot of the patching and a lot of the automation uses those administrative shares. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about any shares that get created other than the administrative shares, because sometimes shares get created that give access to the backups, that give access to source files that get imported in the SQL Server, that give access to information that we really don't want to give access to. And indirectly, they can be used to deploy tools to be able to attack the SQL Server, basically by moving the files onto there and then finding some way to run a process on the SQL Server. The tools are already there, they're already located locally, and they get executed. So I care about shares. I care about shares for data exposure. I care about shares because it could be a step towards exploiting the SQL Server. I also care about whether applications are installed. Now, I'm a purist. I like SQL Server by itself, nothing else installed. And I know there's a lot of DBAs that are that way as well. And the reason for that is because anything else that's installed on SQL Server on the same server as SQL Server from a performance perspective can impact its performance as it competes for processor memory and disk I/O, right? So if I've got a SQL Server and it's my job to make sure it performs well, I want nothing interfering with that. But from a security and audit perspective, the other thing that I'm worried about is anything else I have installed on a server that has SQL Server is potentially vulnerable to attack. And I can think of cases like where a web application was installed on the same box as a SQL Server, and the attack to the server came through the web application because there was a weakness in the web application. And then an adversary was able to basically compromise the server because the web application. Well, now they're a member of local administrators, and guess what? They have the ability to access and compromise SQL Server. So I do care about whether other applications are installed. But I'm also concerned not with things like web applications or some third-party product, but I'm also concerned about management applications, agents. What agents are installed? Who has access to them? What can they do through them? For instance, a lot of backup systems allow you to run scripts before a backup is taken and allow you to run scripts after a backup is taken. In a lot of cases, those agents that are installed on those servers are running as local system. So they have the ability to do whatever they want as far as the operating system is concerned. Who is on the other end of those applications? Is it someone that I trust? And when I say I mean our organization that I'm working for. Is it someone that I trust? Is it someone the organization trusts? And so I do care about those other applications, and I try to minimize those as much as possible. Obviously, you can't minimize all of them. You can't say, well, I'm sorry, you can't use a configuration manager's agent, which we use for patching if you're running SSCM, or if you're using some monitoring app, I'm sorry, you can't put those on there. If you've got VMware and your VMware administrator wants VM tools on there, you can't say no, but you get my point. Anything that's superfluous, anything that doesn't contribute to the bottom line of maintaining that server, then I, as a DBA, try to push back wherever I can. The last thing I'm concerned about at the OS level is the server being properly patched and maintained. Microsoft is, famous for the second Tuesday of the month in their patches. But the reality is that in recent months, Microsoft has had to release several out-of-band patches at the OS level. Some of those are because of disclosures that were made and Microsoft didn't have a chance to respond. Some of those were because of 0 days that were found in the wild. The bottom line is that if the operating system or components of the operating system are not patched, if I'm an adversary, I'm going to do my reconnaissance against that system. And if I can find that it has a weakness in some component, then I'm going to take advantage of that component rather than beating my head against the wall and trying to get to SQL Server some other way. I'm going to take advantage of a vulnerability, I'm going to compromise the system, and then I'm going to go after SQL Server once I've got the system compromised. So from an audit perspective, as a DBA, while it may not be my job to know, or it might not be my job to make sure the server is patched, I care about that fact because it ultimately could compromise my SQL Server. And obviously, if I find that my servers aren't being patched, then I'm going to escalate it through my management chain to try to get visibility so that someone takes it seriously. SQL Server itself, what am I looking for? Well, remember I said that I want to make SQL Server look as small as possible on the network. So I'm interested in seeing what network protocol SQL Server is using. Is it using name pipes? Is it using TCP/IP? In today's world, you probably only need to use TCP/IP. Therefore, name pipes doesn't actually need to be enabled. Maybe you're different in your environment. That's generally the case for me. Shared memory, if your SQL Server doesn't even need to be listening on the network at all because for whatever reason the application is installed locally to the SQL Server and it's the only thing that talks to SQL Server, then the only network protocol that should be enabled is shared. shared memory, right? You don't need to have TCP/IP or named pipes unless you have DBAs that have to administer it remotely and have to connect that way. But even then, there may be a justification for having them be able to log on to the server through some sort of remote desktop system like RDP or another tool, or maybe use Virtual Center if you've got it virtualized, or the light product for whatever your virtualization software is, and be able to connect and administer SQL Server that way. But the point there is if I don't need it, I don't want it turned on. I'm also interested in what ports SQL Server is listening on, and this causes a lot of debate because the default port for a default instance is port 1433. It's well known, and I've seen the debate go back and forth. I'm kind of the opinion that I'm not going to change from the default port because as an adversary, I know how to scan slow enough that my detection won't be picked up by an IDS system, and I will eventually find the listening port for SQL Server. I'll be able to fingerprint it, and then it doesn't matter what port you set SQL Server to listen to, I'm going to find it. Meanwhile, if I leave it as default port and I do have reasons to have end users connect and it's a default instance, then all they have to do is type the friendly name for the server or the server name if you're using that, and they connect, and there's no issues so long as they have permissions to connect. I don't have to tell them to do a comma and a port number. I don't have to tell them to do anything fancy. As far as applications are concerned, the same thing. Their connection strings are rather simple. Troubleshooting becomes easier because you're not looking to see if they got the comma 21733, if that happens to be the port that you've specified or what have you. It becomes easier. But I do understand why, if you don't have it listed on port 1433, then any kind of scripts that automatically connect to the default ports won't work. And so that stops those kinds of things from being able to impact your SQL Server. But whichever side of the fence that you fall on, know what port SQL Server is listening on, keep note of that, and keep track of that. Definitely, that's something that should be in all your server run books and that sort of thing. The question about remote connections, are they allowed? And like I said with the previous example, maybe you have an application that's installed locally on the server, and if so, if nothing else needs to connect remotely to SQL Server, turn off remote connections. As a matter of fact, turn off remote connections, turn off the network protocol, only let that one application connect and make it safe. And I'll give you an example. I was working for one client. They had an application that drove the badges to get into their building, into the various areas of their building. The application was installed locally to the SQL Server on the same server because that's the only way that the vendor supported it. If you wanted to administer the badge system, you went through a web interface that was presented by the badge software. You never went to the SQL Server directly. The only thing that went to the SQL Server directly was the application, which was installed locally. And so I asked the question, does this need to be listening on the network? And the vendor said, no, it doesn't. And in that particular case, I disabled remote connections. I removed the network protocols for TCP/IP and for name pipes, or disabled them, and just left shared memory. And that means you had to actually compromise the OS to have any chance at the SQL Server at that point. Are you configured for Kerberos authentication? If you start SQL Server, if you set up SQL Server to where it uses the virtual service accounts, the MS SQL Server, the MS SQL dollar, name instance name, or whatever, as opposed to a domain account or as opposed to a local account that you create on that box, then SQL Server has the ability to register its SPNs automatically. Service principal names, so that Kerberos authentication can happen automatically. If that's not the case, you're using an account from the domain, or you can either set those SPNs manually, or you can delegate permissions to where SQL Server can set its own SPNs. There's some articles out on how to do that. But really, if we can use Kerberos authentication over the standard NTLM, we want to, because Kerberos authentication gives us some advantages. That's a talk for a different day, but obviously if we can have Kerberos authentication, we want to. There's a reason Microsoft went from NTLM to Kerberos with the advent of Windows 2000. So at this point, 2017, we need to try to get to Kerberos if we can. Also, are you using encrypted connections? One of the things to realize is that most organizations now, the network staff have tools that allow them to see every single packet that goes across the wire. And in actuality, they have tools that record packets that go across the wire. If your SQL Server connections are not encrypted, here's the problem that we run into. I am a network engineer. I don't have rights to see the data as it resides in the SQL Server. I can't connect to the SQL Server. I have no permissions to query that data because my role within the organization means I don't need to see the data. There's a problem on the network between the application server and the SQL Server. I go to troubleshoot it. Guess what I'm now seeing? If the issue is not the network communication between the application and SQL Server, let's say there's a problem with one of the application layers, right? But the data is getting back to the application just fine. The queries are going to SQL Server. SQL Server is responding with the data. Guess what? I'm now seeing the data in the packets because it's unencrypted. If you can encrypt the connections, obviously that you want to do so. And in some cases, your auditors may come back and say, we want you to encrypt the connections. It used to be 5 years ago that if I told an auditor, hey, you know, this is all on our private network, there's no problems, that's why it's unencrypted, an auditor would go, okay, yeah, it's on private network, you're good to go. But nowadays, I'm seeing more and more auditors ask, well, it's sensitive data and it's being transmitted over the wire, and there's all these other people who have access to the packets. Is it encrypted? And so this may be one area you want to start looking at. And like I said, there's documentation in books online. There's some articles about how to encrypt the connections. It's not a hard thing to do. It does require some planning and it does require some coordination, but you can do it pretty much seamless to the applications and to end users. It just requires some work on the infrastructure side. So with all that said, really the questions I'm looking to ask are what needs to connect to SQL Server? And let me throw an easy one out there, right? And a lot of organizations I go into, everybody potentially has access to connect to the SQL Server. If their login gets granted access within the SQL Server, their Windows account gets granted access to the SQL Server, they can log in from their workstation and nothing stops them. But is that something that is really necessary? If a SQL Server only supports a particular application suite and it's only connected to from those application servers, why then does a business user have the ability to potentially connect to SQL Server directly? Probably doesn't need to. And for that matter, why do other applications need to connect? If they don't, then that gives me some ideas on how to reduce the surface area, how to basically tighten up some of the network controls such that Mary Sue, whose computer just got compromised by someone using a phishing attack, can't be used as a jump point to go hit the SQL Server. Right? They have to go and find some other way in. How does things need to connect, right? If the only thing that needs to be connected to is the SQL Server port, there's no need to access shares on the box, there's no need to do any sort of other RPC type calls except for SQL Server queries that come through the SQL Server connection, then maybe I look at using the Windows firewall to block off all those other protocols except for where I need them as far as administrative access is concerned, where patch management is concerned, or so on and so forth. I mentioned that I want to keep the administrators group as small as possible. So when I look at the personnel in the administrators group, the question that I ask is what risk is there, right? And usually I as a DBA don't know that answer, not fully. That's a question I bubble up to the larger organization. Hey, you've got these 15 people in there. What's the risk to the organization? Should this person see this data, not see that data, so on and so forth? I can tell you what I've defined within SQL Server, which you business and overall organization need to tell me more, but this is what I see. And so obviously the smaller you reduce the number of people in administrators group, the less risk to the organization in general. And if there are other apps that are installed on the box that SQL Server is on, what risk does it pose? What am I worried about? What do I need to try to mitigate against? And if I can't mitigate against it, is the organization prepared to accept the risk, right? And once I start asking those questions, and I take it a step further, and I say, hey, can I just restrict the network access, like I said, to just the SQL Server port? If the only thing anything needs to connect to SQL Server as far as applications, end users, or what have you, is the SQL Server itself, then why do I let them hit shares in the first place? I shouldn't, right? And from an audit perspective, if I can go to an auditor and I can say, hey, how do I know that this SQL Server is relatively secure? And I can say, well, one, from the network perspective, Windows firewall, network firewall, wherever you have the layers, the only way end users can connect is to the SQL Server port for this particular set of SQL servers. But that's because they query the data. They connect using Excel. They need to access the SQL servers directly. There's a business requirement for it. Well, this other set of SQL servers, well, you know what? There's no end users that need to connect at all. So we've made sure that they can't. The only people who can connect to SQL Server directly, people are the DBAs. And otherwise, really the only other things that can connect are the applications. Hey, see, I've restricted access. SQL Server is a whole lot tighter. And your auditors will probably go, oh, okay, that's really good. Then that control right there mitigates a lot of other concerns. If I can, I also want to look at reducing the number of admins on the box for obvious reasons. Because if you have a lot of admins or a lot of people with administrative rights to servers, especially servers that have data, especially servers that have data that's considered sensitive or proprietary or financial in nature, auditors get really squirrely when they see a lot of people. And so if I can reduce the number of admins, the better I am. Also the applications. If I'm looking there and I can basically establish that some of the applications that are installed really serve no business purpose, they serve no reason to be there, to manage the server, to make it work the way we want it to work, then hopefully I can escalate and get those removed. Because obviously an auditor is going to sit there and look and go say, hey, I've actually seen auditors walk in and say, hey, tell me everything that's installed on this particular SQL server. And then I'll go through the list and I'll be, okay, tell me about this. What does it do? Well, we just install it globally. Oh, really? So why do you have it on your SQL server? Well, we install it globally. Not good enough. And so these are the kinds of conversations that you can have, and you can point out that an auditor is going to say, well, you can't justify to me why that application is installed on a SQL server. It's a potential vulnerability waiting to happen. Get rid of it. And that might justify you getting rid of some application you really want off your SQL server because you understand that it serves no purpose. Also, if the server is not being properly patched, how do you escalate to get it so that it is, right? Because I've walked into organizations and they've got great patch management strategies, but for whatever reason, they have excluded a particular set of SQL servers. And I'll ask why. It's like, why are those not being patched? Oh, well, because they have a high availability requirement. Okay, what are you doing about that? How do I fix that? Because those servers need to be patched just like any others. As a matter of fact, if you have such a high availability requirement, I would argue that you definitely need to get those servers patched because there are so much remote code execution exploits that can blue screen a box that if you're not patching, you got big problems, right? If I'm an adversary and I just want to cause your business trouble, and I don't care about actually exfilling data, then maybe I run an exploit that causes your box to go into a blue screen loop. Maybe I do something that constantly causes your box to reboot periodically, intermittently, unexpectedly, right? I do stuff like that to mess with you, to break your availability, to interrupt your business. If you patch those vulnerabilities, well, then I can't do that. That's the idea. Outside of SQL Server, a lot to think about, especially if that's not your wheelhouse. Let's focus more on inside SQL Server. And I'm going to be very generic on here because especially when we start talking about logins, you're going to have to go through them and figure them out. When I talk about user databases, obviously each user database is different. You're going to have to figure out, and hopefully you have documented what the application actually requires, how people connect, how they get access to the data, and you're going to have to assess your vulnerability, assess your risk based on the requirements for the application. And I'll be blunt, there are some third-party applications out there that expose you to a huge amount of risk, but the business is going to come forward and say, well, we still need those apps. And those particular cases, your best response is to document your concerns, document what you've done to mitigate the risk, document why you can't mitigate or correct those issues that you see, such that when the auditor walks through the door, they can say, well, you know what, this seems wide open. Well, it is. Well, why is it wide open? Well, let me give you the documentation. Here's the information. Here's why we have to have the database the way it is. And that actually starts at the server level. So let's talk about the things I'm concerned about. Obviously, at the server level, I'm concerned about logins, I'm concerned about roles, and I'm concerned about permissions. Let's break those down a little bit more specifically. So if I'm looking at logins, one of the things that I'm concerned about when I see it is a bunch of Windows users. And I'm not talking about user accounts that are tied to services or applications directly, right? I'm of the view of the 3 a.m. test. And the 3 a.m. test to me is this. At 3 a.m. when I'm woken up with a problem in production and I'm still a half to 3/4 asleep, I want to be able to trace whatever it is I need to trace without a whole lot of thought, without a whole lot of trying to figure out how stuff is nested, so on and so forth. So I'm of the opinion, and others differ on this, but I'm of the opinion that if I've got a service account or an application account that is not tied to a particular person, then I want to see that account explicitly given permission at every step where it is, whether it's a file system, whether it's SQL Server, whether it's within the application, web service, I don't care. I want to be able to go, oh, that's the application for my financial reporting app. That's the login. Yeah, 3 a.m. Hold on, let me get some coffee started. Okay, yeah, it has permissions to the database. The problem's not there. Let me go to the next layer. Oh, someone made an application change. Found it really fast, right? Because if I have to start jumping through nested groups and stuff like that, really hard to do. Service accounts, not talking about those. I'm talking about Mary, Jim, Vashta, any of those people, accounts tied to people. If I see a ton of those in SQL Server, I've got a concern, because my first concern is, why aren't they being managed with a group? The problem that we run into, and especially from an audit perspective, is user account gets created in AD, groups are added, they get access to files, and they get access because we added them via SQL Server directly. User is in one business unit. 6 months later, user is in another business unit. All their permissions change. Or actually, all their permissions are supposed to change, but no one told the DBA. So Jim, who used to work in one business unit, now works in another. He's not supposed to have permissions back to his old business unit, but guess what? No one pulled his permissions from the SQL Server because the DBAs weren't told. That's an audit problem, right? If I'm using Windows groups and I'm managing using Windows groups, then at the AD level, when he should be pulled out of the business units groups for the business unit he's leaving and being put into the business unit groups for the business unit he's moving into, then if permissions are being granted by SQL Server at the group level and as opposed to individual users, then as soon as he's pulled out of one group and put into the other, or one set of groups into the other set of groups, his permissions automatically change. The DBAs don't have to get involved, and there's not going to be a material weakness found where they say, hey, this could cause an issue with financial reporting or something like that. Windows groups, always preferable. I understand that there are exceptions, especially in complex environments. And in those particular cases, if that's the case, your auditors are going to come back and they're going to ask you for what they call a compensating control. All right, you can't use Windows groups. You have to use Windows users. What kind of process do you have to reinforce when a person changes business roles, that the DBAs get notified and the changes in security happen? And that goes outside of SQL Server, which is another reason as a DBA I really like using groups when I can. I'm also concerned if I see a lot of SQL logins, right? If the logins are managed by SQL Server, I'll be blunt. If there are third-party applications that are out there that this is required. There are cases where you have computers in untrusted situations, such as web servers sitting in a DMZ that connect back to a SQL Server. Obviously, those servers probably are not on the domain, and in which case you can't use a Windows-based login. Got it. Okay. In those cases, yeah, I expect SQL Server logins, but I don't expect a lot of SQL Server logins. And when I see a lot of them, especially when I see logins that I can tie to users, as an auditor, that's a red flag to me. Why does Mary have a login? Why isn't Mary using her domain account? Oh, well, see what happened was, what happened is if Mary gets let go, and Mary is bitter about her getting let go, and she finds some way to get onto a computer. Well, Mary can't log on as her account, but if the DBA didn't get notified that Mary goes let go and Mary connects using her old SQL Server login, guess what? You're compromised. Could be something as simple as she comes back to have lunch with some old coworkers and one of them goes off to the bathroom and leaves their computer unlocked and she types into Excel and X fills the data and boom, you're breached. And the problem is that you probably don't know how it happened, right? I'm also concerned when I see Windows logins that no longer exist. Now, this requires you to connect up with your Active Directory and check your Active Directory to see periodically the logins that you have specified, whether or not they are still valid or not. And I'm thinking of groups primarily here, but this also includes when you do have to use Windows users. And the reason I'm concerned about this is if I start to see Windows logins that don't exist after a certain period of time, a couple of days, week, whatever your interval is that you should be checking based on, then that tells me that security changes are not coming down to the DBAs. And as an auditor, that's a weakness. That's an exception. I need to know why that's happening, right? Also, because of the fact that most IT auditors that look at SQL Server now understand that the SA account does not need to be enabled and in fact can be renamed. If I don't see it hardened in that way, if I don't see it disabled, if I don't see it renamed, I'm going to ask why. And there had better be a reasonable answer, or guess what? It's going to be considered an exception. Now, I'll be blunt. If you're doing a service pack, if you're doing a cumulative update, during that time, I'd have a script that reactivates the SA account and renames it back to SA, run your update, then go back and change it, right? And make sure that you document that's your process. Gail Shaw, SQL Server MVP, wrote a post a few years ago. There was a cumulative update that came out, and if you had a renamed disabled SA account, it blew up, right? It's not supposed to happen, but it can happen. And so I'm always the kind that errs on the side of caution. It's really easy for me to run a script across all my SQL servers, update them, and run another script to flip it all back. I'd rather do that than take a chance on having a production system down after patching. And when I say patching here, I mean SQL Server patching or cumulative updates. I don't mean OS patching. That I don't worry about because I shouldn't be touching SQL Server. When I look at logins, SQL Server logins, I'm also looking to see which ones are enforcing password policy. It's going to get the password policy from the Windows device, the Windows server or the workstation if you've got it installed locally. And ultimately, that should be coming from a domain group policy. But if you have it turned off where password policy enforcement is not on at all, I want to know why, right? Because that determines if passwords are remembered. It determines when passwords expire. It determines password complexity, minimum character lengths, how many passwords are remembered, lockout settings, so on and so forth. And it may be that you have an account that is so critical for an application that if someone does try to brute force it, you can't let it lock. You can't let it lock out. In that particular case, you have to turn off password policy enforcement. Great, document it, right? Anything that's an exception to the general rule, document. Have that documentation ready. Auditor rolls in, says, why is it this way? Here you go. Here's the documentation for your exception. Okay, noted. You understand why that is. There's business justification for it. And then, of course, they'll probably ask, well, how do you know that you're not being hacked? And that's when you have to have other compensating controls in place. Password policy enforcement can be turned on and password policy expiration turned off. So a lot of times with an Active Directory, we'll create a user account for a service or an application run on, and we'll set it to password never expires because we can't afford for someone to have forgotten to change the password within a certain interval, and therefore the application goes down. Same idea on SQL Server. Turn password policy on, turn expiration off. Most auditors are good with that if you can explain that that's what you're doing and that follows a policy. And you've got some sort of compensating policy that says, hey, we periodically check the age of passwords for these particular logins, and there's a process to make sure that they get flagged and reported and get updated. I'm also looking at server role membership. Who's a member of particular roles, right? And also looking at server level permissions. Now, if you're some of the auditors are still back in the old SQL 2000 days, and they don't think about the fact that you have permissions at the server level now. But we've had permissions at the server level, which we could define since SQL Server 2000, a product that's no longer even supported. So I care about permissions, and I'm going to audit for permissions, and I'm going to see if people are doing shenanigans using server level permissions. There was one audit that I went in, and sure enough, that's exactly what I found, right? How was the developer getting access? Well, he had talked to DBA into granting him control permissions at the server level. And the DBA didn't understand what had happened and how the developer was getting access. And once I showed the DBA, of course, was very red-faced and very upset. And I said, hey, this is why you have to understand the server level permissions as well. With regards to server roles, as of SQL Server 2012, we got the ability to create our own roles at the server level. And therefore, you should be auditing for those. You can't just rely on looking at sysadmin and security admin and process admin and server admin. Now you need to look to see if there are user-defined roles. And you need to see what permissions are assigned. If I create a role that's called financial app role, okay, on the surface it sounds benign. Well, I would raise a red flag and go, why is there a server level permission called financial app role? But then if I look and I see it has control server permissions, oh, wait a second. So remember that role basically is the equivalent of being sysadmin. That's a problem. Why is it there? And that's what I mean by determine if any replace the built-in roles and see if that's been done. Because as an adversary, if I can, I'm not going to drop myself into the sysadmin role. I'm going to try to create a role, grant it control server rights, and use that, hoping that you've got some sort of automated process that checks security admin, server admin, sysadmin, process admin, but you're not checking for those new user-defined roles, right? Which they're really not new since they've been around since 2012. Permissions-wise, we also want to understand that Permissions are like permissions with regards to folders in Windows file system. So unless I break inheritance, if I've got a top-level file folder, let's say my organizational's drive is the O drive, right? And my department is IT. And at the IT level, I have read permissions. Unless someone goes below that and breaks inheritance, I have read permissions all the way down. So even if it's nested 7 folders deep from IT, unless someone broke inheritance along the way, I have read permissions. Well, SQL Server's permission set works the same way. If I have permissions at one container level, like a folder and file system, but what we call scopes, then I have permissions for anything within that scope to which those permissions naturally apply. And that translates on down. It's a hierarchical thing. So for instance, if I have select permissions at the database level for a particular database, that means for every table in view on that database, I have select permissions defined. If I query and I go, hey, let me see the permissions against that table or view, I won't explicitly see the permissions, but they're there. Now, if I don't have some sort of deny in place to trump that, then I have select, right? And so as a result, I'm looking at permissions from the top down. So permissions at the server level can navigate all the way down into the lowest levels of your databases. So I do care about server permissions and not just the big ones like control. But with regards to permissions, I am concerned about control, and I am also concerned about impersonate, which is something I don't see a lot of auditors focusing on, right? Because if I have the ability to impersonate the SA account, whatever it's been renamed to and disabled if you follow best practices, or a sysadmin level login, then I don't have to have that membership because I can do I can execute commands as that login, and as a result, I have the same permissions, right? And like I said, with regards to permissions, remember the permissions are inherited down, right? They go downward. So I'm concerned with control. I'm concerned with impersonate, and I'm really concerned with really any permissions at the server level, period. I want to know why they're there and if they make sense. So when I get to server level, the first question I always ask, because auditors always ask this question, is who actually needs to connect to the SQL Server? If you have logins that don't need to connect, don't let them connect. Don't have them in the logins, right? It's really that simple. Now, I understand that if you had to give a group connection rights and only 2 out of the 12 members of the group need to be able to connect to the SQL Server, there's nothing you as a DBA can do about it. However, someone in your organization should be looking at how the Active Directory groups are structured to see why those 2 people don't have their own special group because they have their own special function. What else are they being included in that they shouldn't be? The next question is what permissions are actually needed. And this actually applies at all levels, right? If I don't need any server level permissions, then don't grant them. And again, I'm going to reinforce this. How do the cascading permissions, the permissions as they inherit down, how does it impact things? As an auditor, I don't see a lot of our auditors asking this question, but it's only a matter of time before they catch up. Now, granted, like I said, this has been around since 2005. It's 2017. They're going to catch up some point, right? Hopefully. Some auditors have already caught up. They already asked those kind of questions. It really depends on what their background and their experience is. But you as a DBA or a database developer, you care about those things, or an involuntary DBA, you care about those things because you want SQL Server to be secured anyway. But you definitely don't want them showing up and burning you on an audit. Whatever the permissions are at the server level, you're shooting for the principle of least privilege. It's really simple. You give the permissions to do the job. Nothing more, nothing less. Anything more can be compromised and exploited. Anything less means they can't do their job, right? That's our goal. Realize that legitimate user accounts are targets. So just because someone is a particularly trustworthy person doesn't mean anything. As an adversary, I'm looking to get a foothold by whatever user account I can. I'll target spam an organization if I'm an adversary on the outside looking to get in that contains a 0-day exploit that no one's heard of before, compromise the workstation, bam, I'm in. And if it has, and maybe if that person has permissions they shouldn't, then I can use those permissions in a way that you didn't intend. So realize that legitimate users are targets, and it looks like an inside attack, and you have to be aware of those. Also, I will say this, especially as an auditor, and especially as someone who's done a lot of incident response, when you find undocumented permissions or undocumented roles, while they could be a sign of malicious activity, don't immediately jump to that conclusion. Because there are a lot of times when I've found people are trying to make stuff work and they put something in and they forget about it. And it's not that they were trying to do anything, underhanded or sneaky or devious. It was, hey, let's figure out something, and then they got too busy and there wasn't a good process to come back and check in on stuff. So always be calm and collected about when you find stuff, and investigate why. Don't just jump to the conclusion that someone really is looking to break into your system. While that may be true, most of the time I have found when I do security investigations, it's not. It's just someone trying to make something work. Last thing we'll touch on is database level concerns. Most of these are the same as the server level one, so we'll actually go through these fairly quickly so that we'll have some time for questions. I am concerned about how database users map from the login to the database. Because I have a login to SQL Server doesn't mean that I can connect to a database. But for those that do, I want to see how they connect. Because if they have multiple ways in, let's say they're in multiple Windows groups that are granted access, they get the aggregate of those permissions. They all add up, and I get the best, not the worst. And so I do want to know how they map in. I do want to know when someone's using guest user for a database outside of master and tempdb. Master and tempdb, guest user has to be on because of the way SQL Server works. But on a user database, it's a case when I have to have guest user. There are cases, usually tied to something else, but a specific application functionality, but most of the time they're rare. And so when I see it, I flag it and I want an explanation as an auditor. I also care about who the database owner is, and I actually query sys.database principals and sys.databases. So sys.database principals within the database and sys.databases just generically, because I have seen cases where those two get out of sync with each other. Microsoft product that might begin with the SH, I've seen do it to a SQL Server more times than I want to count. But realize that SQL Server would take either of those potentially. Well, definitely. Whoever it recognizes as a database owner, it will treat as DBO, and DBO can do whatever they want within the database, and there's no blocking them, right? So I do care about who's a member of the database owner. I also care about if it's an application. Roles, I am concerned with these particularly. The server roles are well known. These are the ones I focus on within the database. And notice I added DB data reader and DB data writer, and that's because you could have unintended consequences of these. These give implicit rights to tables and views. And so if you're querying database permissions, you may not realize a user has those permissions, and that's how they're getting access, and yet they're able to do something that you think they shouldn't be able to do. And I've had those 3 o'clock calls where AM calls were like, we're not sure why this application was able to modify data, and I'm looking through and I'm like, I don't see it. It's like, and then once the caffeine starts to hit, I'll be like, wait a second, let me check data writer. There they are. That's how they have access. So I care about those. I also do want to look at the user-defined roles. I want to check permissions, and if I've got roles that are nesting, then I want to see what the ultimate permissions are, just like I want to with Windows groups. Remember that you can't just look at who has permissions against this table, this view, this stored procedure. You also have to check at the schema level. You also have to check at the database securable level because of that inheritance that I talked about before. Okay. As an auditor, maybe your auditors are savvy to this. Maybe they're not. But as a professional, IT professional, you should be, and you should understand that. Because here's the thing: if you report in an audit exactly what the auditor asks you, hey, who has permissions to these tables? Can you run this query for me? And you run that query, and they're like, oh, okay, nothing's wrong. And another auditor comes in later and goes, okay, show me who has permissions to the table. And you look and you run it, and they're like, oh, no, give me the schema permissions too. And they run it like, why is there a discrepancy between these two? The previous auditor is not going to be the one in hot water. It's going to be the IT pro. And so you want to make sure that those things are covered as well. Briefly about encryption, if you've got encrypted data in the database and you have SQL Server doing the encryption, right? You're using the built-in certificates, asymmetric keys, symmetric keys. Ask questions around who should be able to see the data and how the key escrow is being handled. In other words, who can unlock the keys? How can they unlock the keys? Are they being secured with passwords that are stored outside of SQL Server? Is there a database master key so the SQL Server can automatically open it up and then open up the asymmetric key or certificate, symmetric key, and then get to the data? Who has permissions to manage all that? Who has permissions to those keys, right? There are specific permissions for symmetric key and asymmetric keys as far as being able to access them. Who has those rights? to be able to potentially unlock the encrypted data. Also, you want to look for the var binary and the nvar columns, know where they are, and to make sure that there are not parallel columns that are actually unencrypted in the database. I have seen that a couple of times where someone, to meet an audit point, encrypted the data, created the column with the encrypted data, but right beside it was the unencrypted data in the normal column. And so I always look and then compare the two. I know that seems silly, but if you think about people just trying to get the job done quickly and meet a point to move on, you can understand how that can happen. The questions that I always ask, if an application uses a login, that's the database owner, it actually owns the database, does it really need to? I understand there are some applications that because of the work they kind of need to. There are others that I really raise red flag and go, why? The corollary, though, is if it's a third-party product, I might determine that the application doesn't need those permissions, but the problem I may be stuck with is that the vendor won't support it unless it is. And if that's a particular case, I get that documentation, I file it away, and when the auditor comes in, I say, well, it's a third-party app, and it's the only way it's supported. The bank or the insurance company or the educational institution that I work for cannot accept the risk of having an unsupported app because of the nature of what this does. And an auditor usually will be like, okay, we understand. Now, what are you doing to put controls around that since you can't use that control? I also ask, do end users have too many permissions? And do service accounts have too many permissions? Obviously, if they have too few permissions, someone's probably already screamed, hopefully. I can't always say that because I've seen service tickets where someone's had a problem for 2 years and didn't speak up. But typically the problem is that when people have too many permissions is what we're worried about, because usually people will scream if they can't do their jobs. But if they have too many permissions and I'm an auditor and I come in and I look and I'm like, hey, well, this service account, why does it have access to these other 3 databases? Oh, well, because someone requested it once upon a time, they thought it would be necessary and no one removed it. Oh, really? That's a problem. That's a weakness. That's an exception. Let's document that. Or the same thing with users. Why does the maintenance crew have access to query this database? Well, what do you mean? Well, you've got the all employees have access to this database. Oh, well, yeah, we did that because that was quick and easy, and we wanted to make sure we didn't miss anyone. Okay, well, you definitely didn't miss anyone, but explain to me why the janitor needs access to the financial data for the organization. Yeah, and so the auditors will be like, that's a problem. That's where you could lose data, and therefore I have to flag it as an exception and need a management response, and somebody is going to be in trouble for it. I already mentioned the case with the DB data reader and DB data writer, and it's one of those things. If I see it, I always try to ask if a user-defined role can be created with the explicit permissions. I do care about if I see sensitive data encrypted or not, preferably encrypted, I want to know who has access and whether or not they are justified to have access by the business. This requires me usually to go outside of my technical realm and go ask the business personnel that are responsible for the data, your data owners, whoever those actually is, or your data custodian, whoever that might be named, to figure out if those are indeed people that should have access to data. If they don't, then I'm immediately starting change proceedings to get them disabled from that data. And then if permissions are identified as too much, what can you do to tighten them, right? So I know I went through a whirlwind of stuff. We could spend a couple of days going through everything that you wanted to audit and be ready for an audit for with regards to SQL Server. This was really just a brief, high level, hit the main points to get you through and get you prepared and thinking about what you need to look at as far as from an audit perspective. So we looked at the OS and SQL Server outside of the engine itself. We looked at server level auditing, the things that you need to be concerned with, database level auditing, and if any of this went by too fast, don't worry, I will post the slides, and you have my contact information. You can send me questions that you may have as well that we don't answer in the few moments that we have left. But with that, are there any questions?
Hi, Brian. HKS, what is your advice for contained database users?
I don't like them, but I understand that they may be a reality in some organizations. So the thing I would say to those is you're going to have to audit the sys.database principles. If you check sys.databases, or if you're I'm using the TSQL. And I'm using the catalog views because I'm assuming that you're going to script to check for this across your environment. Obviously, you can check it manually using the GUI, but if I check sys.databases and I see the right column tells me it's a contained database, then I have another script that's going to fire and query for those contained users. and I just need to be aware of them. And usually there's nothing I can do about them, but I'm going to document them so that if an auditor goes, okay, I see that these are the people that can log into SQL Server. Are there anybody else? And I can go, yes, indeed, they can. This database here that belongs to this application has these contained users, and that's the way it is, and here's the business justification I was given for it. That's how I would handle it. Anytime you see an exception, get it documented, get the business justification so that if anyone has a problem, it's not going to be you, the IT person, the DBA or the involuntary DBA. It's going to be the business person who granted that exception.
Great. Nate Johnson asks, does renaming the SA account have any possible negative consequences? For example, it's often the owner of agent jobs.
No, what you do when you rename the SA account, obviously when you create new jobs, you'll have to specify the correct new name. But I believe that it's being tied by the SID anyway, so it should update automatically. It's something to check. But disabling the SA doesn't do anything because that's one of those little things that people don't really realize about SQL Server unless they play around with disabled accounts and stuff like that. If an account is disabled within SQL Server, processes can still run as that account, right? You can still run queries, you can still execute commands. That's why that impersonate is so nasty. You just can't connect to SQL Server with it. And that's true if a job is owned by, say, the SA and it's disabled and it's renamed. It can still run because SQL Server still recognizes it as a valid owner and recognizes it as a member of sysadmin, so therefore it runs at that permission level.
Great. Pablo Fernandez asks, what is the best option for native auditing but not slowing down performance?
It depends on what you're trying to audit. So if you're just trying to audit changes to permissions, changes to schema, and that sort of thing, none of that should be performance impactful. If you need to go beyond that to where you're like trying to figure out who is querying particular tables and stuff like that, hopefully you're on SQL Server 2008 R2 or higher. Hopefully you're on SQL Server 2008 R2 and higher anyway because of where we are as far as support is concerned. I understand SQL Server 2008 is still supported, but you have extended events, and for the most part, extended events are a whole lot lighter than server traces. There are a couple of exceptions that have been noted by some folks like Jonathan Kahayas, I think that's how you pronounce his last name, and others who have done a little bit of research. But for the most part, they're more lightweight. If you're looking at the audit object that is provided in Enterprise Edition, it actually is built on top of extended events. So you can do a lot of auditing and minimize performance impact by using those properly. And that'd be the direction I would point you to.
Great. And Garrett, I'm sorry, Garrett, I'm going to mess up your name, but looks like Garrett Ponceroli asks, where can we find good auditing scripts?
I have written a lot of scripts and posted a lot of stuff at mssqltips.com, and the reason I write there more often now than anywhere else is because a lot of their articles is, hey, I have a problem, how do I solve it? And so those lend itself more to what people are looking for. There's a lot of there. Obviously, if you go back and you look through the previous speakers for the security VC especially, or the speakers that did security 24 hours have passed, and you go find their blog sites, you're going to find a lot of audit scripts on all those resources. It may require you to kind of munch stuff together and find out what you need, but all those folks, especially the 24 hours of past security that spoke, are known for putting out community content like that.
And I would add one to that list and say, if you need a good script for auditing people who log into SQL Server, Nick Kane has a great script on his site, sirsequel.net.
Yep.
Lots of feedback thanking you and saying it was a great presentation, and that's all the questions we have.
All right, and if anyone else has any other questions, just hit me up on this email, and I'll try to respond in a few days. Thanks, everyone, for attending.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everybody.